Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It started with a question that echoed in my mind for days, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. How is it possible that I'm receiving postcards from places that don't exist? I opened my mailbox one dreary afternoon, the kind of day where the sky presses low, heavy with a promise of rain. Among the usual bills and advertisements, there was an envelope, unmarked except for my name, handwritten in a neat script. Curious, I took it inside, the wind swirling around my feet as I shut the door behind me. Inside, I found a postcard. The front showed a peaceful landscape, rolling hills, a quiet river, the kind of idyllic scene one might expect from a tourist destination. On the back, there was a message, "I hope you're well. Take care. Mark." It was signed simply, Mark. The address was strange. It was almost as if the place didn't exist. I turned the card over, studying the address in disbelief. It read, Station Road, 19, Wyndham, Norfolk, UK. I knew this place. Or at least, I thought I did. There was no station road in any town I had ever heard of, no such place listed in any map I could recall. Yet the handwriting, the quality of the paper, and the stamps all looked genuine. I was puzzled. Perhaps it was a mistake. Maybe someone had sent it as a joke, or maybe it was a mix-up in the post. But as I placed the card back into the envelope, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. My pulse quickened, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Later that evening, I found another postcard. This time, it was from somewhere else. The front was of a dark alley lit by a single street lamp, a quiet place that could have been from any old city. The handwriting on the back was the same, "I hope you're well. Take care. Mark." And again, the address was unfamiliar, Whisper Lane, 13, Ravenford, Yorkshire, UK. My thoughts began to spin. There were no such places, not in any map I could find. Were these strange coincidences? Or was someone playing a cruel game? The cards kept coming, each with the same cryptic message, the same unreachable destinations. With every postcard, the unease inside me grew. As the days passed, I tried to dismiss it, convincing myself that it was just some harmless prank. But something inside me refused to believe it. The addresses haunted me. How could they be real? How could these places exist if they were not on any map? The world felt smaller, as if reality itself was slipping through my fingers. Then, the knocking started. Just gentle at first. Like someone tapping on the window, though no one was there when I checked. It became a constant, a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the night, waking me from uneasy dreams. I began to feel watched. Everywhere I went, the feeling lingered, like eyes were on me. At night, I would sit by the window, staring into the darkness, waiting for the sound of the tap that would return with the dawn. And each time I tried to dismiss the creeping dread, each time I tried to ignore the postcards and the knocks, the reality of the situation became clearer. Someone was trying to reach me from a place that didn't exist. The second postcard arrived 2 days later, just as the knocking had become more frequent, and the air inside the house felt heavier, as if it were pressing in from all sides. I had started to avoid looking out of the window. Every time I did, it seemed as though something shifted just beyond the corner of my vision. It was as if the shadows themselves were moving, waiting for me to look directly at them. This postcard was different from the others. The front showed a foggy, abandoned house at the edge of a dense forest, its windows dark, like empty eyes staring out into the void. I could feel my stomach tighten just looking at it. The same handwriting, the same message. I hope you're well. Take care. Mark. But the address. This one was even stranger. Glimmer Street, 42, Ashwood, Cornwall, UK. I stared at the address, my heart racing. I had done everything I could to find these places. I searched the names online, scoured maps, asked people I knew who had traveled far and wide. But there was nothing. No Ashwood, no Glimmer Street. These were places that simply didn't exist. I felt a shiver run through me. It wasn't just the postcards that were unsettling anymore. It was the pattern. There was something deliberate about it, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind, like I was being drawn into a world that was just beyond the edge of my understanding. That night, as I lay in bed, the knocking started again. But this time, it was louder, more insistent. It was no longer the soft tap that could be brushed aside. It was as if someone was banging on the walls, trying to get in. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of the knocking growing faster, louder, until it was almost deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the cold night air, my breath visible in the sharp, biting wind. The silence outside was eerie, too quiet for a city at this hour. The streetlights flickered as I walked down the path, my footsteps muffled by the wet ground. I reached the end of the driveway, looking up and down the street. Nothing. No one was there. Yet, the sense of something lurking in the shadows was suffocating. I turned back toward the house, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the street, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, a figure stood. A tall, thin silhouette, its outline barely visible, as if it was made of shadow itself. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively took a step back, but the figure didn't move. It was just there, watching, waiting. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat. Had I imagined it? No, I couldn't have. The figure was still there, and now it was closer, just within the edge of the darkness. My blood ran cold. Then, the knocking started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from my house. It was coming from somewhere much closer. From behind me. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the empty street, but there was no one there. No figure. No source for the sound. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. The knock turned into a loud bang, then another and another. Each one seemed to come closer, until I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. My chest tightened, and a rush of panic surged through me. I ran back inside the house, locking the door behind me. Inside, everything was quiet again. Too quiet. I stood in the middle of the room, listening, waiting. The silence pressed in on me, and the chill in the air made me shiver. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out of place. The cards, the knocking, the figure in the dark. It was all too much to ignore. And that's when I realized it. The postcards weren't just a message. They were a warning. Something was coming. something I wasn't prepared for. The third card arrived the next day, just as the tension in my home had reached its peak. I hadn't slept the night before. My mind kept replaying the image of that shadowy figure, its unnatural stillness, the eerie tapping that seemed to come from nowhere. I felt trapped, as though my own home was becoming an extension of the nightmarish world that was bleeding into mine. The postcard this time was different. The front depicted a narrow, winding path through a dense forest, the trees gnarled and twisted, their limbs reaching out like clawed hands. It was dark, as though the sun had never touched this place. My eyes lingered on the image longer than I should have, and a strange sense of dread crawled up my spine. The same message, I hope you're well. Take care. Mark. But the address. Owl Road, 9, Blackwood, Somerset, UK. I felt the same unease rise in my chest, but this time it was more than confusion. There was a certain finality to it, a sense that something terrible was coming for me, and these postcards were just the beginning. I had checked the names once more, the same fruitless search, the same answer, no such places existed. A growing realization began to settle into my thoughts. These were not ordinary postcards. They were linked to something else. They were connected to this creeping, gnawing feeling that had followed me since the first card. These names, these addresses, they weren't just random locations. They were markers, signposts, guiding me towards something or someone that I wasn't meant to find. The knocking had stopped for the moment, but the silence was worse. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. As I stood in the middle of the room, I glanced out the window. It was late afternoon, the light low, casting long shadows across the street. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure again. There, at the edge of my vision, standing just beyond the trees. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. The street was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thoughts, but they clung to me. I couldn't stop thinking about the postcards. Something in them was pulling me deeper into this, whatever it was. I had to know more. That night, I decided to act. I couldn't keep hiding from this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that this was just some strange coincidence. I needed answers. I packed a bag with a few essentials, my phone, a flashlight, a notebook, and the postcards, of course. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something told me I needed to visit these places. I had to see them for myself. If they were real, then maybe I could make sense of it all. If they weren't, maybe it would all end. I drove for hours, heading to the first address that had haunted me, Station Road, Windham, Norfolk. I knew it wasn't real, not in the sense I understood reality, but something deep inside told me I had to go. The journey felt strange. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the more I drove, the darker the world outside my car window became. The landscape was unfamiliar, but I wasn't lost. It was as if the world itself had shifted, pulling me into a place I didn't recognize. I glanced at the postcards again. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to hum with tension. The road turned narrow, lined with trees that seemed to bend inward, closing off the view. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the sound of my tires against the asphalt. And then, I saw it. A sign, old and rusted, half hidden by the overgrown weeds at the side of the road, Windham. I froze. I couldn't believe it. There it was, this place that had been so elusive, right in front of me. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The address from the postcard, Station Road, 19, was supposed to be here, but I didn't see any signs of it. No buildings, no houses, just the empty stretch of road and the creeping fog that was beginning to roll in. I felt a chill settle over me, the air growing heavier, thicker. I continued driving, past the sign and further down the winding road. It wasn't long before I saw the house. It stood at the edge of the trees, its outline barely visible in the thickening mist. The same eerie silhouette as the one on the postcard. My hands shook as I pulled the car to the side of the road. The house, it was almost exactly as it had been depicted. Dark windows, an unwelcoming presence standing in silent defiance against the fog. I stepped out of the car, my breath clouding in the air. The ground beneath my feet was damp, and the sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. I slowly made my way toward the house, drawn as if by an invisible force. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave this place behind, but I couldn't. I reached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was so still, so quiet, and yet it felt alive, as though something was waiting inside. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could touch the door, I heard it. A voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from inside. "Welcome home." I froze. I had never heard that voice before. Yet, somehow, I knew exactly who it was. The figure, the shadow, the one who had been following me. It was here. And it was waiting. My breath caught in my throat as the words hung in the air. "Welcome home." The whisper, barely a murmur, seemed to echo in my skull, vibrating in my chest. I stood frozen at the threshold, my hands still raised, heart hammering in my chest. The cold, damp air felt thick around me, as though it were pressing against my skin, urging me to move, to leave, to forget this place and everything it represented. But I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was drawn to the house by some kind of compulsion, or if the terror I felt was the very thing that made me step forward. Maybe I needed to know. Maybe I was already too far gone to turn back. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound shattering the oppressive silence that had surrounded me. The door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was stale, musty, as if the house hadn't been lived in for years. Yet, as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could see signs of life, faint scratches on the wooden floors, an overturned chair by the entrance, a door slightly ajar. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with an almost final, decisive thud. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, the weight of something unseen pressing on me from all sides. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice shaking. But there was no answer. Only the sound of my breath, shallow and quick, filling the void around me. I moved deeper into the house, my feet careful on the creaky wooden floors. My flashlight flickered slightly, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The house was full of corners and dark alcoves, places where the light couldn't reach, where the air seemed to hang in thick, oppressive stillness. I tried to steady myself. There had to be a rational explanation for this. Maybe it was just a prank, a setup. Maybe I'd find nothing here but dust and cobwebs. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt that there was something else, something I couldn't explain or understand, that had taken root here. I entered the living room, my flashlight sweeping across the walls. Faint smudges marred the wallpaper, like old handprints, faded and yet still there, as though someone had once touched every inch of this place and left a part of themselves behind. And then, something caught my eye. A photograph. It was propped up on the mantel, surrounded by empty frames. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I looked down at the image. It was an old photo, black and white, of a house, this very house, standing in a field of tall grass. The building looked older in the photograph, even more decrepit, the windows dark and hollow, just like the ones I had seen from the outside. But it was the people in the photo that made my stomach churn. They were standing on the porch, smiling. Mark, the name from the postcards, was among them. He was younger, his face barely recognizable, but it was him. And there was something else. A figure, standing just behind him, barely visible, but unmistakably present. The same figure I had seen lurking outside my house, the one who had been following me. I staggered back, the photograph almost slipping from my hands. My head spun. I couldn't breathe. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This house, this place, it wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. This was connected to me. To him. To everything that had been happening since the postcards began. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever had been waiting for me finally made itself known. But as I turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I spun around, desperately trying to orient myself. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. Then, the whisper came again. Louder this time. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't Mark's voice. It was a low, guttural growl, as if it came from somewhere deep within the house itself. I stumbled back, my hand searching frantically for the flashlight, but it was gone. The darkness had swallowed it whole. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, filling my head. It was no longer just one voice. It was dozens, a chorus of whispers, all speaking at once, unintelligible but filled with malice. The walls seemed to close in around me, the very air thickening, making it hard to breathe. Then, a figure appeared before me in the darkness. A tall, thin shape, almost translucent, its features obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its presence. Its cold, oppressive presence. The figure was tall, its limbs too long, its eyes too wide, its face a twisted mockery of something human. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My body was frozen in place, trapped in the suffocating grip of the thing that stood before me. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching out over me, consuming the space between us. You shouldn't have come, it repeated, its voice low and chilling, as though it was speaking from the depths of the grave itself. Then, in an instant, it was gone. The air cleared, the darkness lifted, and the house fell silent again. I stood alone, shaking, drenched in sweat, every part of me trembling with fear. The weight of what I had just witnessed was too much to comprehend. But one thing was certain, whatever this place was, whatever it had to do with Mark, it wasn't over. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I had come looking for answers. But now, all I wanted was to escape. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I knew that. I could feel the walls closing in, could sense that the thing, whatever it was still there, lurking, waiting. I had come for answers, but what I had found was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. There was no escaping the sense that something had already marked me, as if I had become a part of this place, a part of its twisted story. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle, praying it would open. The air felt thick, as though the house itself was pressing down on me, trying to keep me trapped. And just as I reached the door, the whisper came again. Louder now, like a voice inside my mind. You can't leave. I froze, my hand hovering above the door handle. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one that had spoken before, deep, hollow, like something not of this world. I looked over my shoulder, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. Yet, I could feel it, its presence still hanging in the air like a shadow, watching me, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before it consumed me completely. With a desperate yank, I pulled the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I stumbled out of the house and onto the overgrown path, not daring to look back. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just needed to be far away from this place. The woods surrounding the house seemed to close in on me as I ran, the trees twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The ground was uneven, and my feet caught on roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to escape the nightmare that had been unfolding around me. I didn't know how long I had been running when I finally stumbled out of the woods. The sky was dark now, the stars hidden behind a thick, oppressive fog that had settled over everything. I looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of where I was. And then, I saw it. A figure. Standing just at the edge of the clearing. It was Mark. He was standing in the mist, his face partially obscured, his body rigid, like a statue. He didn't move, didn't speak. But I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of his gaze as if he were waiting for something. I took a step forward, my heart racing again, but something in me told me not to. It told me that I didn't want to know what he was waiting for. But I couldn't stop myself. I called out to him. Mark. My voice was weak, trembling. Mark, what's going on? What is this place? What's happening to me? There was no answer. He just stood there, silent, his expression unreadable. The mist swirled around him, thickening until he was nothing more than a shadow in the fog. And then, I saw it. A postcard. It was in his hand, held out toward me, the corner of the card sticking out like a beacon in the darkness. I could see the address, the message scrawled on the back, but it was too far away to read clearly. I stepped closer, drawn to the card, as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. But the closer I got, the further away he seemed. He was fading, vanishing into the fog, like he wasn't even real. And then, just before I could reach him, he disappeared completely, leaving only the postcard behind. I froze, staring at the card as the fog thickened around me. My heart raced. I didn't want to touch it. But I had to. I knew I had to. There was no turning back now. I reached out with trembling hands and picked it up. The front of the card was blank. No picture. Nothing. Just white, empty space. I flipped it over, my pulse pounding in my ears, and there it was. The message. I hope you're well. Take care. Mark. But the address was different this time. It was my address. And then, the final line, written in a different hand, almost as though someone had edited it later. You can never leave. And that's when I understood. I wasn't just trapped in this place. I was trapped in a story. The postcards, the figure, the whispers, it was all part of something much larger than me. something I couldn't escape. I looked up, the world around me spinning, and the figure appeared once more, just at the edge of my vision, too close now to ignore. Its eyes glowed faintly in the mist, and its mouth stretched into a grin. It was smiling at me. And I knew, with a cold, horrible certainty, that I would never escape. The whispers came again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The air around me thickened, and the world began to fade. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't been receiving postcards. I had been sending them, and I had never left. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the whisper, clear and final. "Welcome home." Have you ever felt like you were being watched, but couldn't shake the thought off? Like there was something following you, even though you knew it shouldn't be there? It was a late night. The kind where the world seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. The road stretched out before me, empty and quiet. No other cars. Just the hum of my engine, the soft buzz of the radio in the background, and the occasional flicker of headlights catching the curve of the road. I'd been driving for hours, making my way home from a long trip. The kind of drive that lets your mind wander, where everything around you becomes distant. I knew the road well. It was one of those quiet back roads that wound through fields and thick woods. A road that, at night, could feel like the world was miles away, and you were the only one left on it. I wasn't afraid. It was just another night. The drive should have been routine. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, something caught my eye. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just the dim reflection of a tree or maybe a cloud passing across the moon. But no! This shadow was moving. It was following me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, trying to clear away the exhaustion. Maybe I was seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there. The shadow, long and thin, stretched out across the road behind me. At first, I thought it might be my own. But no! My car's headlights were too far behind me to cast such a shape. I pressed the accelerator a little harder, pushing the car forward, but the shadow kept pace, staying at the exact same distance. I glanced over my shoulder. The road behind me was empty. Nothing was there. No other cars. Just darkness. Yet, that shadow remained, stretching across the road in the reflection, slowly gaining on me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It didn't make sense. Shadows didn't move like that. Not unless something was casting them. But the road was empty. I shook my head, trying to brush off the unease creeping into my mind. It was probably nothing. Just a trick of the light. Maybe it was fatigue messing with my perception. But that creeping feeling didn't leave. In fact, it only grew stronger as the minutes passed, like a presence growing behind me. I kept glancing in the mirror, unable to stop myself, watching as the shadow continued its slow, steady chase. Then, the whispering started. At first, it was barely audible. A rustle in the wind, maybe. But then, it became more distinct. Faint whispers, echoing through the empty car, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded like distant voices, just out of reach. Something I couldn't quite understand, but that gnawed at me. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the hum of the engine, the steady beat of my pulse. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I tried to shake off the fear. But the shadows in the mirror, They weren't just shadows. Something was there. Something was behind me, growing closer. I turned up the radio, cranked it louder, trying to drown out the sound. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They only grew clearer. I felt them. The presence was real. I wasn't just imagining it. Someone was there, following me. The thought hit me hard, freezing me for a moment. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I sped up, my eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror. The shadow was closer now. It was almost too close to ignore. Was it a person? A figure in the road? Was I just imagining the entire thing? I couldn't risk it. I couldn't let it catch me. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the car surging forward, but the shadow still kept pace. I glanced over my shoulder again, my eyes wide, searching for anything. But nothing. The road behind me was as empty as it had been before. Except the shadow. It was closer now. It was almost as if it was walking beside me, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My heart raced. Sweat clung to my palms. The shadow didn't make sense. It shouldn't be there. I could feel the terror crawling up my spine, tightening its grip on me. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. I slammed my foot on the brakes, skidding slightly, pulling the car to a stop in the middle of the road. The shadow stopped too. It was just there, not moving anymore, but somehow still there, looming in the reflection. I sat there, staring at the rearview mirror, trying to steady my breath, my mind racing. Was it real? Or was it my mind playing tricks on me? I was alone on the road. There was no one behind me. There couldn't be. I was just being paranoid. Right? But the longer I stared, the more convinced I became. It was real. There was someone back there, in the dark, watching me. Then, a voice, a whisper so clear, so real, slipped into the car. Why did you stop? My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It wasn't coming from outside the car. It was inside, right there beside me. I slowly turned my head toward the passenger seat, but there was nothing. No one. I turned back to the rearview mirror. The shadow was gone, and so was the whispering. The silence that followed was deafening. But now, I wasn't sure if the danger was gone. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. And as I slowly pulled away, the feeling stayed with me. That heavy presence. The fear that I wasn't alone on this road. Not anymore. I drove faster, eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the dark road ahead, unsure of what waited behind me. What was following me? What had been there all along? The night had become oppressive. Each mile I drove seemed to stretch longer, like the road was winding deeper into a place where time didn't exist. The tension in my chest was suffocating, the air in the car thick with a cold sweat I couldn't explain. I kept my eyes glued to the road ahead, but the image of the shadow lingered, burned into my mind like a brand. Was I losing my mind? Had fatigue completely overtaken me? Or was there something real, something sinister, that had decided to hitch a ride in the dark with me? I glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. But that's when I saw it. A flicker. A movement. Something darting from one side of the road to the other, just out of the corner of my eye. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched, its tires skimming over the asphalt, throwing me forward in the seat. My heart thudded violently in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But nothing was there. The road was empty. I looked around, my eyes scanning the dark horizon. There were no headlights, no figures. Only the endless stretch of asphalt and the trees that lined the road, casting their long shadows across the pavement. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had to keep telling myself that. I had to. But then, the whispers returned. Faint at first, like a breath against the back of my neck. But they grew louder. No longer whispers. They were words now. Low, indecipherable murmurs, like a chant. I tried to block it out, but the words seemed to pulse through the car, vibrating in the very air around me. They were inside my head, their meaning just beyond my reach. I could feel them pressing in, suffocating me. Don't look behind you. It's already too late. The voice echoed in my mind, deep and cold. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to turn my head and see what I knew was there. But the compulsion to do it was too strong. I twisted my neck, my eyes searching the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw only the empty stretch of road, the headlights casting long beams into the darkness. Then, I saw it again. A shape. A figure. It was barely visible in a reflection, but it was there. A shadow. Larger than before. It seemed to be walking now, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with the car. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was so close now, so real, I could feel it pressing against me, like it was standing right there, just behind the glass. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward, the engine roaring in protest. The shadow didn't waver. It matched my speed, moving in sync with me as though it knew exactly what I was trying to do. I looked at the road ahead, trying to ignore the creeping panic clawing at my chest. The trees blurred past, the lines on the road stretching and shrinking with every twist and turn. I couldn't escape it. No matter how fast I drove, the shadow stayed right there, always just behind me. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. I repeated the words in my head, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind. But the shadow was real. I could see it now, no longer a mere outline, but a dark, shifting figure that seemed to stretch and contort with the movement of the car. I felt a chill crawl over my skin, creeping up my spine as the figure began to take shape. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something human, but not human. The whispers grew louder now, like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. The words were clear this time, but they were in a language I couldn't understand. Don't stop. Don't stop. Never stop. I could feel the presence growing, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. My hands were shaking now, sweat drenching my palms as I gripped the wheel. I had to stop. I had to pull over, get out, do something. The pressure was unbearable. But as I glanced at the road ahead, I realized I couldn't. I couldn't stop. Because every instinct in me screamed that if I did, the thing behind me would catch up. It was waiting. Watching. I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror. The figure had moved closer, too close. I couldn't breathe. I could feel the air grow thick, suffocating me, closing in. The voice came again, closer now, almost as though it were in the car with me. You should have stopped. My heart raced as my eyes darted back to the mirror. The figure was standing now, right behind me. A man, no, something tall and shadowy, with limbs that seemed too long, stretching impossibly in the rear view. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it. I felt the eyes. The cold, watching eyes that were trained on me. It wasn't just following me anymore. It had caught up. It was with me. I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The car was speeding faster now, but I couldn't escape the feeling that the thing behind me was closing and getting closer with every breath. The road stretched out in front of me, but it felt endless, like I was driving into oblivion. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been minutes, maybe hours. The darkness was complete, impenetrable, as though the world itself had ceased to exist. When I opened my eyes again, the car was no longer moving. I was no longer driving. I was still. The seat beneath me felt unfamiliar. The leather, the vibrations of the engine, the hum of the tires on the road, they were gone. There was only an overwhelming silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight, suffocating every thought, every breath. I sat up, my heart racing in the cold, empty stillness. The car door was ajar, but there was no sound. No passing cars. No distant sounds of nature, no birds, no wind. Just nothing. I swung my legs over the side, feeling the gravel crunch beneath my feet. The cold air nipped at my skin, but I was too disoriented to care. I stepped out of the car, staring ahead into the thick blackness. The road stretched before me, but there was no sign of where I had come from. No headlights, no markers, nothing to indicate where I was. The road had vanished. The world had vanished. I turned back to the car, half expecting the figure, the shadow, to be waiting for me, watching me from the darkness. But the car was empty. The figure was gone. There was no sign of the thing that had been chasing me. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or terrified. Then, the voice returned. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, clear as day. You shouldn't have stopped. I spun around, looking for the source, but there was nothing. No one. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, swirling around me, digging into my skull. You can't escape. You can't outrun it. My breath quickened, panic surging in my chest. I was trapped. I was alone. But I wasn't. Not really. The road, the never-ending road, kept stretching before me, endlessly, like an open wound. My eyes searched for something, anything, a way out. But the darkness clung to the world like a suffocating blanket. It was all around me, pressing in. I had to keep moving. I took a step forward, but the ground beneath my feet felt wrong. Soft, as though the road itself was shifting, changing, bending beneath my weight. My foot sank deeper into the gravel, as if the road was pulling me in, dragging me back. I stumbled, caught off guard, and glanced down. The shadows seemed to twist at my feet, like the ground itself was alive and hungry. I quickly pulled my foot back, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The road was still shifting, still alive with some unseen force. The darkness was thick, and the oppressive weight of it pressed down harder. I tried to breathe, tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I had to keep moving. I glanced back at the car one more time, hoping, praying that the figure wouldn't appear again, that somehow everything would go back to normal. But the car was still empty. The road ahead was still endless. And then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a distant echo. A voice, but not the voice I had heard before. A laugh. A low, guttural sound that sent chills through my spine. It wasn't just a laugh. It was the sound of something waiting for me to make the wrong move, waiting for me to falter. It came from behind me. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. They were light at first, as if whoever, or whatever it was pacing just out of sight. But they grew closer with each step. Heavy, dragging, like someone, or something, was dragging its feet through the gravel, inching closer and closer. It was here. I didn't need to look. I could feel it. The presence, the weight of it, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt it suffocating the air, trapping me on this road. I had nowhere to go. The car was behind me. The road stretched endlessly ahead. I was cornered. Trapped. Then, the footsteps stopped. The laugh echoed again, sharper this time, and I could feel the heat of breath on the back of my neck. It was close. Too close. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. The road was empty. The darkness seemed to swallow every sound. But the presence remained. And in that moment, I understood. The shadow, the thing that had been following me, it wasn't just after me. It was after everyone. It didn't belong to the road. It didn't belong to this world. It was from somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the reach of logic, beyond the grasp of reason. It didn't care where I went. It didn't care if I ran. It was already here. It was already in my mind, twisting my thoughts, distorting my perception. The voice, the shadow, the footsteps, they were all a part of it. A part of something I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't outrun it. The only thing left was to face it, to let it in, to embrace the darkness. And as I stood there, staring into the void that had swallowed the road, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The air had thickened, suffocating me. I could feel it, like the very atmosphere had turned to something heavier, denser, as if the world itself was closing in. The road, now nothing more than an endless stretch of darkness, seemed to bend and twist at angles I couldn't comprehend. The gravel under my feet felt soft, too soft, like it wasn't even real. I couldn't tell if I was still standing or if the ground had swallowed me whole. I was somewhere else. Somewhere not on any map. The laughter, low and mocking, returned, vibrating in my chest this time, rattling my bones. The sound seemed to swirl around me, as though it was coming from all directions at once, closing in, tightening like a noose around my neck. You think you can leave? It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a force that reverberated through my body, sinking deep into my skin, my soul. The voice wasn't speaking to me from the world I knew. It was speaking through me, as though it had always been here, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The shadow, no, the thing, was everywhere now, in every flicker of darkness, in every rustle of the air. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The weight of it, the thickness of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me, stealing the very breath from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind was drowning in the suffocating void that seemed to surround me. There was nowhere to escape. No one to help. You've always been here, haven't you? The voice whispered in my mind, so close now I could feel its breath on my skin. You thought you could outrun it, but you can't. You never could. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline flooding my body, but I still couldn't move. My body was trapped, locked in place by some invisible force. And then I saw it. Not in the rearview mirror. Not as a shadow on the ground, but right in front of me. A figure. Tall. Dark. Unmoving. It stood at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights, its silhouette sharp against the blackness, the shape impossible to understand. Its features were warped, like it didn't belong to this world at all, as though reality itself was bending and twisting around it. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me, cold, endless eyes, watching. You don't belong here, it whispered. Its voice was a low vibrating in the pit of my stomach. You should have never stopped. I wanted to speak, to beg for mercy, but my voice caught in my throat. I was choking on the darkness. The figure took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. It's too late, it said, its voice growing louder, more forceful, pushing into my skull, twisting my thoughts. You can't escape. You're already a part of this now. I tried to move, tried to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. My body felt like it was trapped in some invisible cage, unable to break free. Every attempt to move was met with resistance, as though the air itself was pulling me back, holding me in place. I was suffocating. Not just from the lack of air, but from the weight of what surrounded me, what had surrounded me all along. The figure stepped closer, its movement unnaturally smooth, as though it wasn't walking at all. It was gliding, floating just above the ground. The more I stared, the more it felt like the air itself was distorting around it, the darkness bending and swirling, wrapping itself around the figure like a cloak. And then it spoke again. This time, it wasn't a whisper, but a command. A forceful demand. Look at me. I didn't want to. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the ground, refusing to meet its gaze, but the pressure inside my skull grew unbearable. I had to look. Slowly, my eyes lifted against my will. I couldn't stop them. I had to see it. When our eyes met, it felt like the world shattered. Like everything I knew, everything I had been, was torn apart in an instant. The eyes weren't just eyes. They were voids, dark pits that sucked in all light, all hope, all meaning. They were empty. They were infinite. And they were full of something ancient, something terrible, something that had been waiting in the shadows for longer than I could fathom. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my body locked in terror, my mind spinning into madness as the figure stepped closer, its shadow engulfing me, swallowing everything. I could feel it now, its influence. Its presence was all around me, inside me, taking over my thoughts, my body, my soul. You are mine, it said, its voice wrapping around my mind, threading through my very thoughts. You were always meant to be here. This is where you belong. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't running from the shadow. I wasn't escaping anything. I had been drawn here. I had always been drawn here. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. I had been chosen. The world around me blurred. The road, the car, the night, everything disappeared, fading into the void. There was no light, no sound, only the endless blackness. Only the eyes of the thing, staring into me, pulling me into its depths. And I knew, with horrifying certainty, that I was already lost. The road had ended, and I was just another part of the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind unable to process what was happening. Time had stopped, or maybe it had never existed at all in this place. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, caught in an endless loop of fear, confusion, and the realization that there was no way out. The figure, or whatever it was now standing directly in front of me. Its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a vice. I could feel the air around me thick with it, its cold, suffocating aura. Its eyes, those endless pits, held me captive, refusing to let me look away. They pulled me in, deeper and deeper, as if they were devouring every piece of me, every shred of my being. It spoke again, but its voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar, a booming sound that echoed through my skull, shaking the very core of my reality. "You're mine now." Its words reverberated through my chest, vibrating in my bones. They weren't just words, they were a command. A truth. And I couldn't escape it. I couldn't fight it. There was no place to run. No place to hide. The figure took another step toward me, and I felt something shift inside me. My body jerked in response, as though I were being pulled by invisible strings that tied me to it, bound me to this place. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the void. It felt like my mouth had been sealed shut, like I was no longer in control of my own body. "You have always been mine." The voice was softer now, almost tender, as though it was soothing me, calming me. "You just didn't know it. You've been running from this, from me, for so long. But it doesn't matter now. It's too late." I tried to break free, to tear myself away from its grasp, but it was no use. The shadow had already claimed me. I could feel its influence weaving its way through my thoughts, my memories, twisting everything into something unrecognizable. I wasn't just trapped in this place. I was becoming part of it. I was becoming part of it. "Welcome home," the figure said, its voice now a low hum in my mind. "This is where you belong. You've always belonged here." The world around me began to distort, bending in on itself, warping like a reflection in shattered glass. The road that had once stretched endlessly before me was now just an abyss, an expanse of nothingness. The car, the night, the sounds, they all disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Everything vanished, leaving only the figure and me. And then, the silence. It was deafening. It was absolute. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. Just the figure and the empty void. I couldn't feel my body anymore. I couldn't feel my heart beating. I couldn't even remember what it had felt like to be alive. The figure loomed over me, its dark form blending with the surrounding void, indistinguishable from the darkness itself. Its eyes, those endless voids, were still fixed on me, watching me, waiting for something. "You're free now," it whispered, its voice like the wind, distant and cold. "Free from all the lies, all the illusions. You don't have to be afraid anymore." The words should have been comforting. They should have been reassuring. But they weren't. They were empty. And then, something inside me broke. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I wasn't just trapped. I understood. I wasn't going to escape. There was no escape. The shadow wasn't something I could outrun or hide from. It was part of me. It had always been. The road had never been real. None of it had been real. I had been chasing something that didn't exist, running from something that was never going to let me go. And now I was part of it. Part of the darkness. Part of whatever this thing was. I could feel myself slipping away. My thoughts, my memories, they were fading, unraveling, swallowed by the void. There was nothing left. No past. No future. Just this moment. Just the figure, watching, waiting. I wasn't sure if I was still alive. I wasn't sure if I was anything anymore. But I understood one thing. This was the end of the road. And I had nowhere else to go. I closed my eyes, and the darkness consumed me. Have you ever seen something so ordinary that it doesn't seem ordinary at all? Something so constant, so routine, that it feels wrong? I hadn't thought about it much at first. It was just a part of my daily commute. I would walk to work, head down, trying to beat the morning rush, and I'd see the same thing, a face. It wasn't a grand thing to notice, at least not at first. It was a face in the window of the office building across the street. An old building with cracked windows and a thick layer of grime on the glass. A face staring out, always in the same place, always the same expression. I first saw it during my second week at the new job. I was on my way into the building, late as usual, and I looked up to see the face. It was there, staring out from a dusty window on the second floor, like it had always been. I figured it was someone working late, or maybe someone who'd been there a long time, a fixture of the building. Nothing strange about it. But then the next day, the same face appeared in the same window. And the day after that. It never moved, never blinked. It was always there. I tried to ignore it. After all, it could just be a person who worked there, a figure who had been standing still for hours at a time, staring out into the street. But it nagged at me. I began noticing it more and more as I walked to work each morning. The face seemed different somehow. It didn't look like someone who was merely lost in thought. There was something unsettling about it. The eyes, dark and hollow, stared through the window as though they were waiting for something, or worse, someone. It wasn't until one morning when I found myself walking to work in the rain when I realized just how strange it was. As I passed under the awning of the building, I glanced up, my eyes naturally being drawn to that same window. The face was there, but something was off. The figure's posture was the same, its face just as impassive, but there was something wrong with the glass. The window, which had always been covered in dust and grime, was clearer. Too clear. The streaks of dirt had been wiped away. But that was impossible, wasn't it? No one had ever gone up there to clean it. I felt an odd tension in the air, like I had walked into a place I didn't belong. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I pushed the thought away and entered the building. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. But as I sat at my desk, the feeling didn't leave me. The face stayed with me. It was always there in the back of my mind, looming in the corner of my thoughts. I kept telling myself it was just a person working in the building. But something about it felt wrong, like I was missing something, something I was meant to notice, something important. That evening, as the office started to empty out and the quietness of the night began to settle, I found myself staring out of the window at that building across the street. The face was still there. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten. The streetlights flickered as the night deepened, casting strange shadows on the buildings around me. The longer I looked, the more the face seemed to move, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't a shift in position or a change in the figure's posture, but something deeper, more subtle. The eyes seemed to be following me, watching me more intently now. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was almost as if the figure was closer than it had ever been before. I couldn't pull my eyes away. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the world outside seemed to dim. The office building, once so familiar, began to feel like something foreign, something unnerving. The face in the window, the stillness of it, began to unsettle me in a way I couldn't explain. What was it? Why didn't it move? I left the office that night with a sense of dread creeping over me. The street felt longer than usual, as if the shadows stretched out further than they had before. I hurried home, trying to push away the thought of that face. But the image lingered, and I couldn't shake it. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept imagining it, the face, watching from the window. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just the figure that unsettled me. It was the stillness of it. The fact that it hadn't moved, not once, day after day. And that made me wonder, who was on the other side of that window? And why didn't anyone else seem to notice? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face again, its eyes staring right through me, into me, as though it knew something I didn't. It felt like it was waiting, watching, and I had no idea why. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The face. The way it hadn't moved, how it had lingered in my mind like an unwanted memory. The thought gnawed at me during my walk to work. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, but something in me kept urging me to look again, to see if it was still there. As I approached the office building, the familiar sight of that dirty, forgotten window across the street immediately drew my attention. The face was there. The same expression. The same stillness. It hadn't changed at all. I found myself staring up at it, trying to make sense of what was so unsettling about it. I squinted, feeling a strange sensation, like I was missing something important. Something that was just out of reach. The window had been cleaned. Not perfectly, but enough for me to see through the smudges and dust. It wasn't just the grime that had been wiped away. There was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. The face. It was clearer now, more defined, as if the layer of dust had somehow obscured the details. But as I looked, I felt an odd, creeping unease. I stepped closer to the window, trying to get a better look. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained my eyes. The face was still the same. Pale. Unblinking. But something was different. The eyes, they weren't just lifeless anymore. They seemed to be following me, tracking my every movement. The longer I stared, the more I felt like it was aware of me. Like it knew I was there, watching it. I quickly turned away from the window, a wave of nausea washing over me. I hadn't been able to stop myself from looking, even though I had promised myself I wouldn't. And now I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I didn't understand. As the day dragged on, I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept returning to that face, to the way it had seemed to follow me, even in the silence of the office. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or the building's old windows distorting the view. But that explanation didn't sit right. No matter how I tried to explain it, a part of me knew that something far more unsettling was happening. Around lunch, I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head. I couldn't stay cooped up in that office with that feeling of being watched gnawing at me. As I walked down the street, I kept my head low, trying to avoid looking at the building. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't escape that pull. I found myself walking in the direction of the office building, almost on autopilot. I crossed the street, my steps slow and deliberate, and before I even realized it, I was standing directly in front of the building. I looked up at the second floor. The window was the same, grimy, streaked with dust. But there was something different this time. There was movement. I squinted, trying to focus. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the blinds, but then I saw it again, the face, it was gone. I felt a chill spread through me. The window was empty. For the first time, there was no face staring out at me. But the absence of it felt worse than the face itself. The air seemed to grow still around me. I stood frozen, staring up at the window, waiting for something. Anything. But there was nothing. Then, a faint scraping sound reached my ears. It was coming from above, from the office building. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same noise I had heard the other day when I had touched the window. That low, unsettling scrape, like something was dragging across glass. But now, it was louder, more pronounced. I took a step back, my pulse racing. I didn't want to be here. I needed to leave. But before I could turn and walk away, something caught my eye. At the edge of the second floor window, just beneath the grime and dust, a small, pale handprint appeared on the glass. The dust had been smudged, as though something, or someone, had pressed against it. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I knew I shouldn't be there. I knew something was wrong. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't stop looking at that window. My legs felt heavy as I stepped back, inching away from the building. The handprint remained on the glass, the dusty outline of a palm slowly fading as though it were disappearing, as though it had never been there at all. But I had seen it. I knew I had. I turned quickly and walked away, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But as I walked down the street, I felt it, that pull. That same weight pressing on me, like something was following me. I could almost hear the faint scraping sound in the distance, like it was trailing behind me, getting closer. I rushed back to the office, my mind racing. What was happening? What was going on in that building? As I sat at my desk, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind to focus on work. But every time I looked up, my eyes wandered to that window across the street. And every time, I saw that face again. Or did I? I wasn't sure anymore. Was I going mad? Was I imagining it all? Or was something truly watching me from that window? Something waiting. I didn't know. But the feeling wouldn't go away. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the thought that the face wasn't just a face anymore. It was something else. Something darker. Something that wanted me to see it. To know it was there. And I was running out of time. The days passed slowly, stretching like the long shadows that crept across my office floor as the sun set each evening. But the unease, the feeling of being watched, never left. It clung to me, an oppressive weight that I couldn't shake off. Every time I glanced at the window across the street, the face was there, waiting, its eyes staring back at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The building across from mine had become a prison in my mind. Each morning, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the light, or the distortion of the glass. But I knew better. The face wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. Or at least, it felt real. But what did it mean? Why was it always there, always watching? And why did it seem so familiar? I couldn't answer those questions, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it. And the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it became. It was like a magnetic force that drew my attention, no matter how much I wanted to look away. That evening, I decided I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I had to know. I had to get inside the building. I waited until the office was mostly empty, until the familiar hum of conversation and keyboards had faded into silence. I grabbed my coat and slipped out the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I crossed the street, the same unease that had plagued me for days, creeping up my spine. I had to know what was behind that window. I couldn't let it control me any longer. The building was quiet when I entered, the lobby empty except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I stood there for a moment, gathering my thoughts, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I had no plan, no idea what I was looking for. But something told me I needed to get to the second floor, the floor where I'd seen the face. I walked to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside. As the elevator ascended, I couldn't help but stare at my reflection in the polished metal doors. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving behind me, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, lifeless hallway behind me. I pressed the button for the second floor, my finger lingering for a second longer than necessary. As the elevator stopped, I stepped out into the corridor, the faint scent of dust and stale air filling my lungs. It felt colder here, as though the temperature had dropped a few degrees in the time it had taken for me to get here. The silence was thick, suffocating. I walked toward the window at the far end of the hall. The office doors on either side were closed, locked, or deserted. The building was eerily empty. And then I saw it. Through the cracked blinds, I could make out the faint outline of the figure, the face I had been so fixated on. It was there, as if waiting for me, its pale features clearer now that I was so close. But something was different. The face was still, its eyes unblinking, but there was an unnatural quality to it. A stillness that felt wrong. I stepped closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I leaned in. My reflection stared back at me from the other side of the window. But something about it didn't feel right. I had never seen myself quite like this before. My face was distorted, twisted, as though someone, or something, had altered my features. My eyes were wide and blank, empty. The more I stared, the more my reflection seemed to move. I couldn't look away. It was as if the reflection in the window wasn't mine at all, as if the face staring back at me was a stranger. And then I saw it, the thing that sent a cold shiver through my spine. Behind me, in the reflection, I saw the figure again. The face. But it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was closer. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. There was no one behind me. I whipped my head back to the window. The figure hadn't moved. It was still in the same place, still staring. But the reflection had changed. The figure in the glass was no longer behind me, it was in front of me. I staggered back, my hand gripping the window frame to steady myself. My breathing became shallow, ragged. This couldn't be real. I was losing my mind. But then, the figure moved. Not in the way a person moves. Not the subtle shifting of limbs or the slow turn of the head. No, this movement was abrupt, unnatural. It slid across the window, as though it was gliding along the glass without the hindrance of flesh or bone. It stopped, inches from me, and for a moment, we were face to face. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a coldness that cut straight through me. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot. And then, slowly, the figure began to smile, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a wave of terror crashing through me. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a crack, followed by the sound of glass breaking. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, the figure was gone. The window was empty. Silent. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, threatening to choke me. I turned and ran from the room, my footsteps echoing in the hallway. The elevator was a blur as I slammed the button for the ground floor, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. As the elevator descended, I looked up at the mirror on the wall. For a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing behind me, just out of the corner of my eye. I whirled around, but there was no one there. I stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby, breathing heavily. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't stay anywhere near this building. But as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the face was still with me, that it was always with me. It was waiting. And I had no idea how much longer I could outrun it. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. My mind was unraveling, each thought a thread hanging loosely, just barely tethered to reality. I tried to resume my normal routine, forcing myself to go to work, but the weight of what had happened, the unshakable feeling of being watched, was never far behind. I couldn't escape it. The face was everywhere. In my dreams, in the reflection of shop windows, in the shadows of my own home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I felt its cold gaze on me. I couldn't tell anyone. How could I explain it? How could I tell them about the figure behind the glass, the smile that wasn't human, the reflection that wasn't mine? They would think I was crazy. And maybe I was. But even as my grip on reality loosened, I knew one thing for certain: the face was real. It was out there, and it was coming for me. One evening, after another sleepless night, I found myself standing in front of the office building again. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things. Maybe I just needed to see it one last time to confront whatever this was. I crossed the street, my steps slow and heavy. The building loomed in front of me, its dark windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamps. It looked normal, ordinary, nothing out of place. But I knew better. I had seen what was behind those windows, what was waiting for me. I hesitated before pushing the door open. The lobby was empty, just like it had been that night. I walked to the elevator, my hand trembling as I pressed the button for the second floor. The familiar chime echoed through the silent building, and I stepped inside, my reflection staring back at me from the polished metal doors. The elevator stopped with a soft jolt. I stepped out, my pulse quickening. The hallway was just as I remembered, cold, quiet, and empty. But something was different this time. The air felt thick, as though something was hanging just out of reach, waiting to descend. I walked down the hall, drawn toward the window, toward that face. When I reached it, I stopped. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The blinds were open now. I could see inside. But it wasn't the office I had expected to see. The desk was gone, the chair overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The walls were cracked and peeling, the room in complete disarray. And in the middle of it all was the figure. It was standing in front of the window, its back to me. I could see its outline, the familiar shape I had come to dread. But something was wrong. Its head was turned, just enough for me to see its face. The smile. The same slow, deliberate grin from before. I couldn't look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring out the window, waiting for me to make the first move. I stepped closer. My heart was pounding in my ears. Sweat was trickling down the back of my neck. I reached for the window, my hand shaking as I gripped the edge. The moment I touched the glass, the room shifted. The air around me grew heavy, suffocating. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt, just slightly, as though the building itself was shifting. I backed away, my breathing shallow. The figure's eyes locked onto mine through the glass, the smile widening into something twisted, something inhuman. And then, as if in slow motion, it began to move toward the window. The glass didn't stop it. It didn't even seem to touch it. The figure glided, no longer walking, but drifting toward me. I stumbled back, my hands pressing against the cold wall for support. I couldn't think. I couldn't move fast enough. The air around me was thick with an overwhelming presence, the walls closing in, the space shrinking, until the only thing that mattered was the figure moving closer, its smile growing ever wider. I turned and ran. I ran down the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, the soft sound of footsteps, but they weren't quite footsteps. They were more like a whisper, a shuffling of something far too light to be human. I reached the elevator. I pressed the button again and again, but it didn't come. The floor beneath me groaned, the building shaking slightly, as if reacting to my panic. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, the end of it just a dark blur. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and far too close. "Don't run." The words sent a cold jolt through my body. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the emptiness of the hallway. I pressed the button again, but this time the elevator doors opened. I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my reflection staring back at me from the metal walls. The figure had followed me into the elevator. When the doors opened, I bolted into the lobby, and for the first time in days, I didn't look back. I didn't care. I didn't want to see it anymore. I ran out into the night, the city streets a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment. I locked the door. I closed the blinds. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I had escaped. But as I sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at the walls, the feeling never left. I couldn't escape the face. I couldn't escape the smile. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Forever. Have you ever wondered what would happen if time itself began to unravel? What if the past could be rewritten, or, worse yet, if it could come to haunt you, forcing you to relive moments you thought were long forgotten? I've been living in an old apartment for the past few months, one that has always felt a little off. I never wanted to stay here for long. It wasn't the kind of place I'd typically choose, but with the rising cost of rent and the fleeting options available, I settled for it. The building was old, the hallway always smelled of damp wood, and the floors creaked under every step. But the worst part was the clock. It was an ancient thing, a brass mantel clock that stood on the living room shelf. It was a relic, one of those timepieces that looked like it should belong in a museum. At first, it seemed harmless enough. But one evening, while I was sitting in my favorite armchair, reading, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint tick-tock, but it was off. The rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. I glanced at the clock. Its hands had moved. But it wasn't just the time, it was moving backward. The second hand was spinning in reverse, slowly, as though it was tracing the moments of the past. I didn't know what to make of it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Perhaps exhaustion had gotten the better of me, or maybe the old apartment was playing tricks on my mind. But the more I looked at it, the clearer it became. The clock's hands were not just moving backwards, they were changing things. Not much, just tiny details at first. The shadows seemed to grow longer than they should. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, as if the room itself was retreating into some distant memory. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tick-tock sound reverberated through the walls, a constant reminder that something was wrong. My eyes darted to the clock over and over again. The second hand was back to its starting position, but it would jump again, moving backward with an almost deliberate cruelty. I tried to dismiss it, but the more I ignored it, the more it began to feel like it wasn't just the clock that was affected by its strange reversal. It was as if the entire apartment was being pulled back in time, slowly erasing the present. I would hear things, little sounds that didn't belong, whispers just out of earshot, footsteps in the hall when I knew I was alone, the faintest tapping at the door, like someone, or something, was knocking on the other side. The clock's ticking had a strange power. It felt like it was pulling at the fabric of my reality. I knew I needed to figure out what was going on before it consumed me. But the more I watched, the more the apartment seemed to change. The furniture would appear just slightly different when I wasn't looking, and sometimes, when I passed by a room, I could swear I saw something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. It was always fleeting, always just a glimpse. The clock didn't stop. It couldn't stop. And every time I checked it, the hands moved even farther back, the minute markers slipping further into the past, like a forgotten dream. I began to feel as if I was trapped in a moment that had already happened, where time no longer worked as I knew it. At first, it seemed like just a strange, disorienting event, but soon, I realized that things were changing around me in ways I couldn't explain. The air smelled different, colder, with the scent of old wood and dust. The floor beneath my feet creaked more loudly as though it was older than it had been just a moment before. The apartment seemed to age before my eyes, taking me with it. The strangest part was when I saw it, the face. I had walked into the kitchen one evening, feeling an odd sense of unease, when I looked out the window and saw something in the reflection of the glass. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps the shadow of a bird flying past. But no, it was a face. A face I had never seen before. It was only there for a moment, just long enough for my heart to lurch in my chest. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I turned to look around the room, but everything was as it should be. The clock continued its backward ticking, and the shadows grew longer, as if in response to the strange presence I had felt. I had to know more. I needed answers. But the clock, I realized, wasn't just a witness to time, it was a gateway to it. The past was slipping back into the present, and it was taking me with it. The next morning, I tried to dismiss the eerie sensation that clung to me like a cold fog. I told myself it was nothing more than a bad dream, a figment of my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But as the day unfolded, the unsettling feeling refused to leave. The clock, still ticking backward, became my obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know how it worked, why it moved against the flow of time. The more I focused on it, the more I realized that the changes around me weren't merely in my head. Something about the apartment, the objects within it, had shifted. They were slowly becoming echoes of a past I couldn't remember. It was in the small details at first. The rug in the hallway, which had once been a modern design, now looked faded, as if it had been there for years. The painting on the wall, one I never paid much attention to, was now slightly askew, as if someone had moved it recently. But it wasn't just the objects. It was the air itself, growing thick, as if it were retaining the weight of years gone by. I decided to do what anyone in my situation would do. I went to the clock. I stared at it for what felt like hours, watching as the hands reversed their motion, pulling me deeper into the unsettling grip of the past. I knew that I couldn't just ignore it. Something about this clock, about its unnatural backward ticking, was altering reality itself. I could feel it in my bones. In the evening, I stood near the clock, trying to trace its movements with my eyes. The second hand ticked backward, then stopped entirely, hanging motionless for a brief, terrifying moment. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing the cool brass. Suddenly, everything changed. The room around me flickered, as if the very air was warping. I blinked, and the apartment seemed to stretch, grow older. The walls creaked louder than before, the wooden floor groaned as if burdened with time's weight. The lights overhead dimmed, their glow flickering as though powered by a failing current. For a split second, the apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt distant, as if I was no longer in the present. I turned toward the window. The view outside was different now. Instead of the usual streetlights and cars, I saw something else, something from a time long past. The buildings had an old, worn look to them, their brick facades cracked and faded. The street below was empty, save for a few people walking in old-fashioned clothing. I could feel my pulse quicken as I realized that the clock wasn't just reversing time in the apartment, it was pulling the world around me backward too. I had to know what was happening, why I was being dragged through these strange moments. I rushed to the living room and tried to focus on the details. I thought I saw the face again, just a fleeting glimpse in the reflection of the window, but it was there. It was the same face. That strange, emotionless expression staring at me from across the room. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. There was no one else here. There was no one who could be behind that face. I turned around in a panic, but the room was empty. The face, whatever it was gone. The apartment was silent, save for the ever-present ticking of the clock, now moving even slower, its backward march like the slow unraveling of a forgotten story. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just some bizarre coincidence. I was being pulled into something far deeper, something connected to the past. I could feel it, pressing in from all sides, threatening to consume me. But how could I escape when I couldn't even trust what I was seeing? The clock had changed everything. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was a force, a powerful pull that was drawing me into its mysterious past. I had to find out where this all started. Why the clock was reversing time. What it wanted from me. As I paced around the apartment, the ticking continued, louder now, faster, as though the clock was growing more insistent. I had the overwhelming feeling that it was leading me somewhere, to something. And though I didn't want to admit it, I knew I had to follow. But when I reached the hallway, everything went still. No more ticking. No more creaking of the floorboards. Just silence. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It had stopped entirely. For the first time, it was motionless. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. It came from behind the door at the end of the hall, the one I had never opened. I knew then that I was no longer in control. The clock had stopped. Time had stopped. But whatever was beyond that door, it had not. The whisper echoed through the hallway, an eerie, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of old paper or the faintest breath of wind. It was coming from beyond the door at the end of the hall, the door I had always avoided. The one I never thought to open. The silence was oppressive, like the moment before a storm breaks. I stood there, frozen, my hand hovering near the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a byproduct of stress and sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was happening here, something that was pulling me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I grasped the cool brass handle. It felt heavier than I remembered, as though it had been waiting for me to turn it, to open it. I hesitated for just a moment, the fear creeping in, but then I forced myself to turn the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that I had never seen before. It wasn't part of the apartment, I was sure of that. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and worn, with patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of age and neglect. The floor beneath my feet was covered in dust, the kind that hadn't been disturbed in years. But what struck me the most was the clock. It was in the far corner of the room, standing tall and imposing, like a sentinel guarding the secrets of the past. Its brass casing gleamed dully in the dim light, and its face was eerily familiar. It was the same as the one in the living room. The hands were still moving backward, ticking slowly, inexorably, dragging time with it. But this one, this clock, was far older, its design much more intricate, with strange symbols carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize. I stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind me, though I hadn't touched it. The air felt colder now, as if I had crossed into another world entirely. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one amplifying the strange tension that hung in the air. I moved closer to the clock, unable to resist the pull it had on me. As I approached, I could hear the ticking more clearly now, each second stretching longer, like a drawn-out breath. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the clock's frame. The moment my skin made contact, I felt a jolt of energy shoot up my arm, sharp and cold, as if the clock had come alive. And then the room began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of my vision, the slightest change in the light. But then the transformation became more pronounced. The wallpaper started to change, the patterns morphing into something darker, more foreboding. The air grew thick, and I could feel the weight of time pressing down on me, heavier with each passing second. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the room seemed to grow larger, stretching out before me, warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. The clock's hands moved faster now, spinning in a chaotic dance, and with each revolution, the past seemed to bleed through the walls. I could hear voices, distant, muffled at first, but growing louder with every tick of the clock. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, a rhythmic chant that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The floor beneath me trembled as if the building itself were waking up from a long, deep sleep. The whispering returned, louder this time, and this time it was not just a whisper. It was a voice. A familiar voice. It was my voice. But it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the clock. I turned, panic surging through me as I looked at the clock's face. The hands were still spinning wildly, but now something else was happening. The numbers on the clock were shifting, rearranging themselves, as if they were alive, as if they were speaking to me. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The room fell into complete silence. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I stood frozen, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The clock, now motionless, was no longer just a clock. It was a portal, a doorway into the past, a manifestation of something far older and more powerful than I could comprehend. I could feel its presence in every corner of the room, pressing against me, whispering my name, pulling me deeper into its grasp. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a shadow at first, just a shape in the corner of my eye, but as it stepped into the dim light, I saw it clearly. It was me. But it wasn't. It was a version of me from the past, wearing clothes I had never seen before, with eyes that seemed to look right through me. It smiled, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I felt true terror. The clock had brought me here, and now it was showing me what I was always meant to see. What I had forgotten. And as the figure reached out, I knew that whatever was about to happen, I couldn't escape it. The figure stood before me, its eyes, my eyes, locked onto mine. The smile on its face was unsettling, not one of warmth, but something colder, more predatory. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice in my head, as if it were whispering directly into my thoughts. "You should have never come here," it said, its voice distorted, echoing in my mind. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the air thickening, suffocating. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my legs felt frozen, my body trapped in place by some unseen force. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were unnervingly smooth, as if it was gliding across the floor rather than walking. Every step it took seemed to draw the darkness closer, as if it were feeding off the space between us, feeding off my fear. "You remember me, don't you?" it whispered again, and for a moment, I felt a strange pull, a flicker of recognition. It was as if the face before me, the one that mirrored my own, held a part of my past that I had buried long ago. A part of myself I had forgotten, and now it was returning to claim me. My chest tightened. Memories, fragmented and fleeting, began to surface, snippets of faces, places, voices that felt distant, yet intimately familiar. I saw glimpses of a life I didn't want to recall, a life I thought I had left behind. A life that seemed to have never truly left me. I struggled against the paralysis that held me. My throat felt dry, my breath shallow, but I had to fight it. This wasn't real, I told myself. This wasn't me. Yet, the longer I stood in that room, the less I was sure of anything. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward me, fingers curling like tendrils of darkness. As it moved, the clock's hands began to spin again, faster this time, as if urging the moment forward. This wasn't real, I repeated, but my voice sounded distant, even to me. The room was no longer just a room, it had become a stage, and I was trapped in the middle, unable to escape the play that was unfolding. The figure was almost upon me now, its face mere inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath, like a chill that crawled beneath my skin. It was no longer just a reflection. It was me. It was the version of me I had abandoned, the part of me that time had stolen. "You left me," it said, its voice rising, becoming a low growl that vibrated the air between us. "You thought you could escape. You thought you could change." I recoiled, but the figure's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with unnatural strength. The sensation was like ice, like the fingers of death itself curling around me. I tried to pull away, but it only tightened its grip, pulling me closer, its face now fully illuminated in the dim light. "You can't escape," it hissed. "You were always meant to be here." I gasped for air, but the room had become suffocating, as if the very space around me had folded in on itself, closing me off from any chance of freedom. The clock's ticking had become maddening, its sound overwhelming, echoing in my ears, making it harder to think. My mind raced, and with a surge of adrenaline, I managed to wrench my wrist free, stumbling backward into the darkness of the room. I could hear the figure laugh, low and menacing, like the sound of a broken record repeating itself over and over. I stumbled toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room had shifted again. The doorway, the only exit, was no longer where it had been. The walls had expanded, pushing it further away. "No," I thought. "I need to get out of here." But the room seemed endless now, twisting and stretching like a maze that had no exit, no way out. I turned, trying to make sense of the new layout, my breath coming in frantic gasps. The walls had closed in so tightly that I could barely see anything in the dim light. The clock, too, had moved. It was now in the center of the room, its hands still moving backward, spinning uncontrollably, faster than before. The symbols carved into its frame seemed to writhe, as though they were alive in a way that wasn't natural. And then I heard it again. The whispering. It came from all sides now, filling the room, reverberating in my head. It was as if the clock itself had begun to speak, each tick a sentence, each second a command. The voices of people I didn't know, speaking in riddles and echoes. The language was unintelligible, but the message was clear. You are trapped. You belong here. Time is not your friend. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I turned to see the figure moving toward me again, its body now rippling and shifting like smoke in the air. It was not just a reflection. It was a shadow of my past, of something I had hidden deep within me, something I have refused to face. I could hear its voice once more, this time clearer than ever. "This is your fate. This is your reality." The figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that it was not just me I was running from. It was the part of me I had buried, the choices I had made, the things I had done. All of it had caught up with me, and no matter how far I ran, it was always here, in this room, in this moment. I was never going to leave. The clock's hands spun faster. The walls closed in. The door remained out of reach. And the past, with all its twisted secrets, reached out to claim me. I couldn't breathe. The room had become a suffocating void, swallowing me whole. Every inch of space felt like it was closing in, as if time itself was collapsing around me. The clock's hands spun so fast now, I could no longer track the minutes, the hours, everything was blurring, warping into one indistinct moment. And still, that whispering voice echoed in my head, louder with each passing second, each tick of the clock. "This is your fate," it hissed. "You can never escape. You are part of it now." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. "This isn't real," I told myself. "This can't be real." But the pressure in my chest only grew stronger. The air felt thick, heavier, as though something unseen was pushing against me, forcing me to accept this nightmare. My mind raced, but it was no use. The figure was getting closer, its form shifting with each movement, becoming more monstrous, more unrecognizable. "You left me behind," it murmured, its voice now barely a whisper in the vast, oppressive silence. "But you'll never be free. We are one, you and I." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My voice was lost in the blackness that surrounded me. The figure's face was almost within reach now, its eyes burning into mine with an intensity one couldn't escape. For a moment, I thought I saw something in its eyes that wasn't just my own reflection. It was a deep, endless abyss, like the very core of time itself, and I could feel myself falling into it, drowning in it. I had to get out. I stepped back, my body moving on instinct, but the room stretched further, growing ever larger. It was a maze that had no end, no escape. The walls were alive, pulsating with the rhythm of the clock's ticks, each beat a reminder of my entrapment. The figure loomed before me, its smile now a twisted grimace, and I knew with horrible certainty that it wasn't just haunting me, it was part of me. In a frantic surge, I pushed past it. My legs moved on autopilot, desperate to escape, desperate to find something that felt real. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't focus on anything except the pressing feeling of doom that followed me. I stumbled through the room, my hand brushing against the walls, feeling their cold, uneven surface beneath my fingertips. Suddenly, I stopped. Something felt different. The whispering had ceased, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The clock had stopped ticking. The air was still, as if time itself had frozen. I turned slowly, afraid to look, but my eyes were drawn to the center of the room. The figure was gone, but the darkness remained. I felt a tremor run through me, a ripple of unease that started in my chest and spread to my limbs. The silence was deafening. The room had stopped moving, yet the feeling of being trapped was worse than ever. It was as though the walls were no longer just walls, but a part of me, my fear, my regrets, my own mistakes, all pressing in, refusing to let go. And then, I saw it. At first, it was small, just a flicker of movement at the corner of my vision. A shadow in the corner of the room, flickering in and out of existence. I turned, but there was nothing there. I blinked, and again it appeared, a figure standing in the farthest corner of the room. I couldn't make out its details, but I knew it was watching me, just as the figure had been before. I moved toward it, my steps slow, deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of my own fear. The closer I got, the more real it seemed, until finally, I reached the corner, my hand outstretched. But when I touched the space where it had been, there was nothing. Nothing but a cold chill that shot up my spine. It was gone. But the feeling remained, the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. The clock started again, its hands ticking slowly, deliberately. I looked up, watching as the time reversed. Every second, every minute, dragging me back to a moment I couldn't escape. The silence returned. And then, the room began to shift. It wasn't just the walls anymore. It wasn't just the clock. It was everything. The entire space around me was folding, twisting, warping like the fabric of reality itself. The room I had been trapped in was no longer there. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but when I opened it, I found only darkness beyond. There was no hallway, no escape. It was just me and the ticking of the clock. And then it hit me. The realization that had been slowly building in the back of my mind. I was never meant to leave. The room wasn't a trap. It was my prison. The clock was not an instrument of time, but of fate, looping me in an endless cycle of my own making. The reflection in the mirror, the figure in the darkness, it was all me. All my past mistakes, my choices, my regrets, chasing me. And now, there was no escape. The room, the clock, the figure, they were all part of me. Part of my past. Part of the person I had become, or rather, the person I had always been, trying to outrun time, trying to outrun myself. But I had failed. The clock ticked backward, and I knew this was where I would remain. I pressed play. The familiar whirring sound of the recorder filled the quiet room, a soft click signaling the start of the recording. It was my voice. I had made this recording earlier that afternoon, after a long day at work, sitting in my car before driving home. I had been talking to myself, rambling a bit about the usual mundane things, the weather, the traffic, and thoughts that came and went as I idly tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. I didn't expect anything strange. But now, as I sat alone in the dim light of my apartment, listening to the recording, a chill crept up my spine. "Is it always this quiet here?" my voice asked from the recorder. I frowned. That wasn't something I had said. I rewinded the recording, hearing the same sentence again. "Is it always this quiet here?" And then my own voice continued, "You should turn around. It's watching you." I froze. What? I didn't remember saying that. In fact, I was sure I hadn't said anything like it. I was alone in my car, wasn't I? There had been no one with me. But now, listening to the recording, my heart started to race. A question I never asked, a phrase I didn't speak, yet here it was, clear as day. My own voice, but not from my memory. I paused the recording, staring at the small device in my hand. A part of me wanted to convince myself it was some mistake, maybe an echo, maybe something I missed in the rush of the day. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had listened to this recording before, in the car, just to make sure the voice memo function worked. I hit play again, my breath caught in my chest. This time, the voice was more distinct, more immediate. "You're not alone." I felt my throat tighten. It was as if the voice knew exactly what I was thinking, like it was speaking to me, directly into my mind. I hit pause again, my finger trembling. I didn't know what to make of it. This was impossible. There had to be an explanation. It couldn't be real. Could it? My mind raced, searching for any rational explanation. Maybe it was just a glitch in the recorder. Maybe my tired mind had mixed things up and I was imagining things. But no, "You're not alone." The voice was too real, too clear. Suddenly, a soft rustle came from the other side of my apartment. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see something or someone, but the room was still. Just the dim light from the desk lamp and the steady hum of the refrigerator. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was then that I heard it again. A soft crackle from the recorder. "It's behind you now." I jerked the recorder away from my ear, heart pounding in my chest. I had to turn around. I had to look. But I didn't want to. Fear gnawed in my stomach, cold and relentless. There was no way anyone was in my apartment. No way. I was alone. Yet, there it was, those words, those voices, in the recording, as though they were speaking to me from somewhere, behind me. With shaking hands, I slowly placed the recorder down and stood up, the floor creaking under my feet. I turned towards the back of the apartment, my eyes darting across the dark hallway that led to the bedroom. The air was still, eerily still. But my mind kept replaying those words, "It's behind you now." I forced myself to move, inching toward the hallway. My breath quickened, each step heavier than the last. The silence seemed to thicken with every footfall, pressing against me like a weight. And just as I reached the edge of the hallway, something in the air shifted. It felt like a presence, something just beyond my line of sight, lurking. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to turn the corner. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint glow of the hallway light casting long, unsettling shapes on the walls. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, as I'd left it earlier. I stood there, frozen, staring into the dark space beyond. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, came from the recorder still lying on the table in the living room. "Why haven't you looked yet?" I bolted back to the living room. The recorder was sitting there, exactly where I had left it, but I hadn't touched it since I heard that voice. The thing is, I had turned it off. I had clearly pressed stop. But now, as I picked it up again, my own voice echoed through the tiny speaker, cutting through the silence like a knife. "You were always meant to find this." The voice on the recording wasn't mine anymore. It was something else. Something dark. I held my breath, staring at the recorder in disbelief. Something inside me broke. It was as though the voice had been waiting for me to hear it, to listen, to confront whatever was beyond. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. The voices were coming, no longer from the recorder, but from within the walls. They had always been there, waiting. I had just never listened. And I realized with a sinking feeling in my gut that I was never alone. Not in this apartment. Not in this life. And the voices would never stop. The whispering continued, swirling around me like a whirlwind. It wasn't just in the recorder anymore, it was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, it felt as if the very fabric of the apartment was alive, breathing in time with the voices. My head throbbed with their rhythm, each syllable pressing into my skull like a physical weight. "You can't run from the past. It will find you. It will always find you." The voice was no longer just a whisper, it had grown louder, more insistent. Each word scraped against my mind like nails on a chalkboard, sending a sharp tremor down my spine. I stumbled back, pressing my hands against my temples, trying to block out the sound. But it was pointless. The voices weren't coming from anywhere. They were inside me, in my thoughts, pulling at the strings of my memories. My own fears, regrets, and secrets that I had buried deep inside, all of them coming to the surface now, demanding attention. The apartment felt small and now, suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, reaching out towards me, twisting and warping. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air, a fog that hung heavily in the stillness. I could hear the ticking again, faint at first, like the soft tap of a distant clock. But as I listened, it grew louder, louder than before, and in sync with the voices. Each tick was a beat, a pulse that matched the growing panic in my chest. I turned toward the source of the sound, and my gaze locked onto the wall. Something had changed. There, in the corner of the room, a small crack had appeared in the plaster, like something had broken through. The crack was dark, almost like it was sucking in the light around it. I stepped closer, my heart racing. The voices became clearer. It's here. It's already inside. Don't look at it. I reached for the crack, my fingers trembling. I couldn't stop myself. I had to look. I had to know what was on the other side. The voices were urging me, calling to me, growing louder with every second. There was no turning back now. With a sharp exhale, I pressed my palm against the crack. It was cold. Cold and alive. The surface seemed to shift under my touch, as though the wall itself was breathing, pulsing beneath my skin. Then, without warning, the wall gave way. The plaster crumbled beneath my hand, and a deep, unnatural blackness yawned open before me, like the mouth of some great beast. I stumbled back, but the darkness reached for me, pulling me in, swallowing the light whole. My pulse was deafening in my ears as I backed away, my body rigid with terror. The voices, my voice, was now a cacophony of whispers, screeching, pleading, crying from all around me. You cannot escape. The darkness before me shifted, and I saw something. No, not saw, felt. A presence. It was there, just beyond the edges of my vision, and as much as I wanted to turn away, I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes from the growing void in the wall. Something was pushing through it. I heard a sharp click, followed by another. The ticking of a clock. It was louder now, closer. The sound seemed to be coming from within the darkness itself. My own heartbeat was muffled beneath it. Each tick seemed to slow down time, stretching the moments, making them unbearable. Then, I saw it. A shape. A figure, crawling out of the darkness. At first, it was indistinct, a blur of shadow and movement, but as it emerged fully, it became clearer. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. His face was obscured by the blackness of the void, but I could see his hands, his long, bony fingers reaching toward me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My body froze in place as the figure took another step forward, and then another. The ticking grew faster, louder. I could feel the walls pressing in on me as I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes wide with fear. The figure stopped just in front of me, its presence heavy, suffocating. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. I opened my mouth, desperate to scream, but all that came out was a choking gasp. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it simply reached out, its hand hovering inches from my face. The room was filled with the sound of its breathing, low, ragged, like a wind through dead leaves. And then, finally, the voice, my voice, came through the darkness again. You're not alone. You never were. With a violent jolt, I snapped awake. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the floor in the living room. The recorder sat silently beside me. The room was still, the air thick with tension. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around. Nothing. The darkness had gone. The clock was ticking steadily, just as it always did. I didn't know what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Had I somehow been transported to some other place, some other time? Or was it something else entirely? I slowly picked up the recorder, my fingers trembling. I pressed the play button. The first sound that came through the speakers was my voice. Is it always this quiet here? And then, just as before, came the chilling whisper. It's behind you now. And the room, once again, went completely silent. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. The whisper echoed through my mind, each word seeping into my thoughts like ink spreading across a page. It's behind you now. I turned around, slowly, fear clenching my throat. The apartment seemed the same, silent, unchanged, but something was wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, more pronounced, as though they were watching me, waiting. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my racing heart. This had to be a trick of the mind, some kind of twisted illusion. The recorder couldn't possibly be repeating itself. It couldn't. But as I opened my eyes again, I saw it, the clock. It was ticking backwards. The hands were spinning wildly, jerking in unnatural directions. The sound of the ticking was frantic, like the frantic beat of a trapped heart. I could feel the world around me unraveling, time itself stretching and contorting. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like stone. The weight of the air seemed to press down on me, forcing me to stay rooted in place. You can't escape, the voice whispered again, this time louder, sharper. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, each syllable digging into my flesh, my bones. I reached out, grabbing the recorder with trembling hands, desperate to stop the nightmare from repeating. But as soon as I touched it, the darkness enveloped me again. The walls stretched and warped. The room twisted in on itself, becoming smaller, suffocating. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I was no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold and distant, with no escape. The shadows were alive, swirling around me, closing in. The figure, the man from before, appeared once more. This time, his face was clearer, more distinct. I could see the hollow eyes, the pale skin stretched tight over his skull. His mouth opened, and I could hear the faintest of whispers. You have to come back. The voice was mine. But it wasn't. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the walls closed in, and the figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out for me. You cannot escape, it said again, its voice thick with the weight of inevitability. And then, the clock stopped. Time stopped. The world froze. I was still in my apartment, but I wasn't. The air was still thick with dread, but there was something else now, something darker. I could feel it, pressing against me, suffocating me. I looked at the clock again, but this time I didn't hear the ticking. There was nothing. Just silence. And then, as if it were a faint memory, the whisper returned, "You're not alone." The clock began to tick again. Slowly at first. But as it did, I knew something had changed. Time, the past, the future, it was all slipping through my fingers. The cycle had begun again. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was to come next. But deep down, I knew. This was just the beginning. The voices would always return. The clock would always tick backward. And I would always be trapped, caught in the endless loop. The cycle continues. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the floor in the living room. The recorder sat silently beside me. The room was still, the air thick with tension. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around. Nothing. The darkness had gone. The clock was ticking steadily, just as it always did. I didn't know what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Had I somehow been transported to some other place, some other time? Or was it something else entirely? I slowly picked up the recorder, my fingers trembling. I pressed the play button. The first sound that came through the speakers was my voice. Is it always this quiet here? And then, just as before, came the chilling whisper. It's behind you now. And the room, once again, went completely silent. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with an unspoken presence. The whisper echoed through my mind, each word seeping into my thoughts like ink spreading across a page. It's behind you now. I turned around, slowly, fear clenching my throat. The apartment seemed the same, silent, unchanged, but something was wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, more pronounced, as though they were watching me, waiting. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my racing heart. This had to be a trick of the mind, some kind of twisted illusion. The recorder couldn't possibly be repeating itself. It couldn't. But as I opened my eyes again, I saw it, the clock. It was ticking backwards. The hands were spinning wildly, jerking in unnatural directions. The sound of the ticking was frantic, like the frantic beat of a trapped heart. I could feel the world around me unraveling, time itself stretching and contorting. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like stone. The weight of the air seemed to press down on me, forcing me to stay rooted in place. You can't escape, the voice whispered again, this time louder, sharper. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, each syllable digging into my flesh, my bones. I reached out, grabbing the recorder with trembling hands, desperate to stop the nightmare from repeating. But as soon as I touched it, the darkness enveloped me again. The walls stretched and warped. The room twisted in on itself, becoming smaller, suffocating. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I was no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere cold and distant, with no escape. The shadows were alive, swirling around me, closing in. The figure, the man from before, appeared once more. This time, his face was clearer, more distinct. I could see the hollow eyes, the pale skin stretched tight over his skull. His mouth opened, and I could hear the faintest of whispers. You have to come back. The voice was mine. But it wasn't. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the walls closed in, and the figure stepped forward, its hand reaching out for me. You cannot escape, it said again, its voice thick with the weight of inevitability. And then, the clock stopped. Time stopped. The world froze. I was still in my apartment, but I wasn't. The air was still thick with dread, but there was something else now, something darker. I could feel it, pressing against me, suffocating me. I looked at the clock again, but this time I didn't hear the ticking. There was nothing. Just silence. And then, as if it were a faint memory, the whisper returned, "You're not alone." The clock began to tick again. Slowly at first. But as it did, I knew something had changed. Time, the past, the future, it was all slipping through my fingers. The cycle had begun again. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was to come next. But deep down, I knew. This was just the beginning. The voices would always return. The clock would always tick backward. And I would always be trapped, caught in the endless loop. The cycle continues. Have you ever been in a place so quiet that the silence feels louder than any sound? That's how it always is for me during my shifts at the bookstore. I work the night shift from midnight until the first light of dawn. The store is small, tucked away in an old corner of town, with creaky wooden floors and shelves that stretch from floor to ceiling. The books, all so still, seem to hold secrets that I'm never sure I want to uncover. It's usually peaceful. Just me, the dim glow of the overhead lights, and the occasional rustle of pages as I go about my duties. But tonight, something feels different. I can't quite put my finger on it, but the air is heavier, thicker, almost as if something is watching. The first sign is small. A book falls. It's one of the old hardcovers, a thick volume on history. It's perched neatly on a middle shelf, and I'm sure I haven't touched it all night. So, when it tumbles to the floor with a loud thud, I jump, my heart racing. I bend down to pick it up, brushing off the dust, and place it back in its spot. But as I do, I notice something strange. The spine of the book feels warm, almost too warm for a book that's been sitting in this spot for years. I shake it off, thinking it's just my nerves getting to me, but the feeling lingers, crawling up my spine. I continue to work, trying to focus on the usual routine, shelving, dusting, checking the inventory. But then it happens again. Another book, this time a small paperback, falls from the shelf. It's almost as if someone, or something, is pulling them down, one by one. I move quickly, picking up the book, my hands trembling. This time, I look around the store, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence is deafening. It's so quiet that I can hear the faintest creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet as I walk. I take a deep breath and shake my head. I'm being paranoid. It's nothing. Just an old building settling, right? But when a third book falls, I can't ignore it any longer. This time, the book is open. I stare at it for a long moment, confused. How could it have fallen open? There's no draft, no air moving in the store. The page is dog-eared, as if someone had been reading it recently. My fingers hover over the page, and I hesitate before flipping it over. I need to see what's written. The first line catches me off guard. You will see something you cannot explain tonight. My pulse quickens, a chill running down my spine. I glance around the bookstore, feeling the weight of the words press against me. What is this? A prank? No. There's no one else here. It's just me. I close the book quickly, but the words still linger in my mind. Something is wrong here. Something I can't yet understand. I place the book back on the shelf, trying to calm my nerves, but the feeling of being watched doesn't go away. It's as if the very walls of the bookstore are closing in around me, and I can't shake the feeling that something is waiting, lurking just out of sight. But it's just a coincidence, right? Just a random occurrence. I try to focus, but every time I glance at a shelf, I feel the pull of those words, the chilling premonition written on the page. The weight of it is unbearable. As I continue my work, another book falls from the shelf. This time, it's different. The book is open, and the page is marked with underlined phrases. I pick it up, trembling, and the words on the page make my stomach twist with unease. You are not alone. You are being watched. They know you. I freeze. My heart is pounding in my chest now, and I feel a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I drop the book back onto the floor, stepping away from it. What is happening? Who is doing this? The store is silent again, but the air is thick with a tension I can't escape. Each breath feels like I'm inhaling something dark, something ancient. The words are stuck in my head, replaying over and over again. I glance at the clock on the wall. It's nearly time for my shift to end, but the thought of leaving the store now makes my skin crawl. I can't shake the feeling that something is coming, something that I can't avoid. Something that the books are trying to tell me. I glance back at the shelf, and that's when I see it, another book, falling from the shelf. This time, it doesn't land open. But when I pick it up, there's a note inside. I unfold the note, my hand shaking as I read the words written in a neat, precise hand. You've already seen too much. The end is near. The words are written in ink, but the handwriting is unfamiliar. My throat tightens, and the darkness in the store seems to grow deeper. I'm not alone here. And the books are telling me something I don't want to know. I can't seem to breathe. The note feels heavier in my hand, as if the weight of it is crushing me from all sides. I read the words over and over again, but they don't make sense. My mind races, trying to make sense of what's happening, but every thought feels like it's slipping through my fingers like water. I glance at the clock again. Only a few minutes have passed, yet time seems to stretch unnaturally. The bookstore is suffocating, the air thick with the stench of old paper and something else, something cold and metallic. The silence that envelopes the store now is oppressive, the kind of silence that settles deep in your bones. I glance back at the shelves, expecting to see more books, more messages. But they're all in their places, perfectly aligned, like nothing has happened. I glance back at the note in my hand, my fingers trembling as I fold it back up and tuck it into my pocket. I can't focus. I can't think straight. But something is different now. I feel it. A presence, something watching, something that wasn't there before. I glance at the far end of the bookstore, where the shadows grow long and deep, and I swear I see a figure standing between the shelves. Just a flicker of movement, but it's enough to send a jolt of panic through me. I shake my head. It's nothing. It has to be nothing. I'm just tired, running on too little sleep. But as I walk toward the figure, I can feel my heart pounding louder in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. There's nothing there. Just empty shelves and the faint echo of my footsteps. But I can't shake the feeling. It's like I'm not alone, like something is just out of sight, waiting. I force myself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the rising anxiety in my chest. This is ridiculous. There's no ghost in the bookstore. No one is watching me. It's just my imagination running wild, nothing more. Then I hear it, a soft thud, followed by another, and then another. Books falling. One after the other, like they're being pulled from the shelves by an invisible hand. I turn, my stomach flipping, and watch as book after book tumbles from their spots, hitting the floor with sickening thuds. I rush to gather them, my mind racing. But as I pick up the last one, I notice something strange. The titles of the books, how could I have missed it before? The titles are all familiar, but they seem to be shifting, changing right before my eyes. Time and Memory. The Weight of Words. The Endless Night. Each title flickers, changing for an instant before settling back into its original form. I blink and rub my eyes, but it happens again. The titles aren't just changing, they're responding to me, reacting to my presence. I reach out for one of the books, my hands unsteady. This time, the book feels different. The cover is cold to the touch, and as I flip it open, I'm not surprised to see more underlying passages. But this time, the message is clearer. You can't stop what's coming. It's already begun. I slam the book shut, my breath coming in short gasps. The store feels colder now, as if the temperature has dropped several degrees in the span of seconds. I glance around frantically, my heart hammering in my chest. The shelves are full of books, but I can't help but feel like they're all watching me. The air seems heavy, as if it's pressing in from all sides. I try to calm myself, to think logically. But the more I try to reason with myself, the more the tension builds, the more the air thickens. The words on the pages, the underlined phrases, the messages, they're all real. And they're all pointing to one thing: I'm not in control anymore. I walk over to the counter, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet. The clock on the wall ticks louder, echoing through the silent bookstore. I look at the time, only 15 minutes until my shift ends. But I don't know if I can make it that long. A sudden noise cuts through the silence, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the back of the store. My breath catches in my throat, and I freeze. It's not possible. There's no one else here. The footsteps grow louder, closer. My heart races as I turn slowly, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there's nothing. Nothing except the sound of those footsteps. Then, from behind one of the shelves, a figure steps out. It's not a person. It's something else. Something that shouldn't exist in the bookstore, something that defies explanation. The figure is translucent, flickering like a reflection on water. It moves toward me with a strange, unnatural grace, its face obscured in shadow. I can't move, can't speak. The only sound I hear is the pounding of my own heartbeat, deafening in my ears. It stops just a few feet away from me, and I feel its gaze, cold, empty, and endless. I can't look away, even though every part of me screams to run. And then, as if in response to my fear, the figure lifts its hand. It reaches for the nearest book on the shelf and pulls it free. The book opens on its own, pages flipping rapidly, stopping at a random spot. I hear the faintest whisper, a voice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You should have listened. The words are the final straw. My body moves on its own, every instinct screaming at me to escape. I turn and sprint for the door, the sound of the figure's footsteps following me as I run. The bookstore seems to stretch before me, the exit feeling farther away than it ever has before. But when I reach the door, it won't open. The handle won't budge, no matter how hard I pull. I'm trapped. And I can feel the figure closing in behind me, its presence growing stronger, its whispers louder. It's too late now. I'm suffocating. My lungs feel as though they're being crushed, the air too thick to breathe. The whispering grows louder, more insistent, like a chant that is coming from all around me. The figure, still just out of my reach, continues to move toward me, its translucent form flickering and distorting with every step. I try again to open the door, my hands slick with sweat. The metal handle doesn't even twitch, no matter how hard I pull or twist. My heart pounds in my chest, my vision narrowing. The room seems to close in around me, the shelves, once comforting, now feel like prison bars. The smell of paper and ink is suffocating. Please, I gasp, not sure who I'm begging, please, let me out. But the figure doesn't respond. It just continues to watch me, its face still obscured by the shadows that ripple unnaturally around it. The closer it gets, the colder the room becomes. My breath comes out in visible puffs, and I begin to shake uncontrollably. It feels like I'm being drawn into a nightmare I can't escape. Then, out of nowhere, a noise. A loud, harsh scraping sound. The book I'd opened earlier, the one with the underlined passage, slides off the counter, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. The sound breaks through the tension like a knife, and for a moment, everything stops. I can't look away from the figure. It's so close now that I can see the outline of its face, twisted and distorted, its eyes hollow, black pits where there should be light. It opens its mouth, but no words come out. Just a low, guttural hum that rattles my bones. Then I hear something else. A whispering voice, softer, almost kind, coming from the book on the floor. The same book that had fallen earlier. The voice sounds familiar, but I can't place it. My legs move before I even think, and I stumble toward the book, drawn by some unseen force. As I reach for it, the hum of the figure grows louder, but the voice from the book quiets the noise in my head, like it's trying to soothe me. The pages of the book flip open to the same passage I'd seen before. You can't stop what's coming. It's already begun. I can't breathe. The words are etched into my mind, and they resonate like a warning, a truth I can't deny. My hands shake as I hold the book, feeling the weight of it growing heavier in my grip. It feels as though the air around me has stopped moving, the world outside the bookstore gone, leaving only the strange presence in the room with me. I glance at the clock on the wall. Only a few minutes have passed since I checked it last, but it feels like hours. Time is stretching, warping. The seconds tick by, but they feel endless. I glance up at the figure once more. It's standing directly in front of me now, its cold gaze boring into me. And then, for the first time, it speaks. You should have listened. Its voice is like the sound of rustling pages, soft and unearthly, but its words ring in my mind like a death sentence. I can feel it. It knows something about me. It knows everything. The room begins to darken, shadows creeping across the floor, filling the corners with a suffocating blackness. My body goes cold, my teeth chattering. Every muscle in my body tenses, preparing to run, but my feet won't move. I try to scream, but the words stick in my throat, caught in the air that is thickening around me. My breath is a sharp, panicked rasp. I close my eyes for a moment, trying to collect myself, but the whispering, always there now, grows louder. It's in my head. The words from the book are repeating over and over again, and then I hear another phrase emerge, different this time. You're already part of the story. I don't understand. What does it mean? What is happening? The figure reaches out, its long, thin fingers curling like claws toward me. I can't pull away. I can't move. I stare at its outstretched hand, hypnotized by the coldness radiating from it. The moment it touches me, my body freezes, every nerve in my body locking into place. A sudden, sharp pain lances through my chest, like a blade being driven into my heart. My breath comes in gasps as I clutch my chest, trying to breathe, to break free from the pain, but it only intensifies. I can feel the figure's presence seeping into me, its coldness wrapping around my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pain stops. The figure withdraws its hand, and I collapse onto the cold floor of the bookstore. The world spins around me, and I struggle to keep my eyes open. The bookstore is silent again, eerily so. But this time, something has changed. The shelves no longer feel familiar. The books are no longer just books. They are watching me. Waiting. I feel the weight of their presence, like each one is a piece of something larger, something I can't fully comprehend. I pull myself up to my knees, my body trembling. The figure is gone, but the cold still lingers, thick in the air. I'm alone now. I glance at the clock again. The hands have stopped moving. Time has come to a halt. And then, in the silence, I hear it. A page turning. It's coming from the book I dropped earlier, the one that started this all. I don't want to look, but I can't help it. Slowly, my head turns toward the counter, and I see the book open on its own. The pages flicker, like the book is breathing. The words on the page are different now. You were never meant to leave. I freeze, my heart stalling in my chest. The truth settles over me, cold and unyielding. The bookstore is alive, and it owns me now. I try to move, but my legs refuse to obey. My body feels numb, paralyzed, as if I've been woven into the very fabric of this place. The book continues to turn its pages, each one a whispered promise of something I can't escape. You were never meant to leave. The words burn into me. They pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they're coming from somewhere deep within the bookstore itself. It feels as though the walls are closing in, the shelves leaning closer with each passing moment. The air grows thick again, colder than before, and I shiver uncontrollably. Every inch of my skin is crawling, as if the shadows themselves are reaching out to touch me. I want to scream, to break free, but it feels like my voice has been stolen, trapped in the silence of the room. The clock still hasn't moved, the hands frozen at a time that no longer makes sense. The air hums with the tension of 1,000 unread stories, 1,000 voices that I can't understand, but can feel. With great effort, I finally force my legs to work. I push myself up from the cold floor, each movement jerky and unnatural. The book on the counter flicks another page, the sound like a soft sigh, as though it's urging me to keep going. I approach it hesitantly, my heart pounding in my chest. The book feels heavier now, the words seeping into my thoughts with an almost malevolent intent. The air around me seems to distort, the shelves no longer merely holding books, but alive, watching, waiting for something. The silence is suffocating, and my own breath is the only sound I can hear, ragged and shallow. I reach the counter and stare down at the open page. The words are different now, more specific. The story is not yet finished. It has only just begun. My hands tremble as I flip the page, feeling the weight of the paper beneath my fingers. Each page seems to resonate with the same sinister energy that has overtaken the room. It's as if the book itself is a living, breathing entity, and it knows me. It knows my thoughts, my fears. The next page reads, "You will read these words, and they will change you. But you will never be able to forget them." I stumble backward, the words sinking into my mind like a blade carving through my thoughts. I feel them etching themselves into my memory, something I can never undo. The book is no longer just a book, it's a doorway, a portal to something much darker than I could ever comprehend. I hear the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. They echo through the store, slow and deliberate. They're not mine. I know they aren't. I turn around, my heart racing, and there it is, the figure, standing at the far end of the aisle, its face still hidden in shadow. Its presence sends a chill through me, the coldness wrapping around me like a vice. It hasn't moved since the first time I saw it, yet I can feel it watching me. Waiting. The whispering starts again, the same unintelligible murmur from before. But now, I can make out a word. Return. The word cuts through the silence, sharp and demanding. I feel a compulsion to obey, as if the figure is speaking directly to me, guiding me, forcing me to follow its will. It's like a command that has been planted in my mind, impossible to ignore. The bookstore, the walls, the shelves, all of it is shifting, reshaping, bending to the will of the figure. It's as if the whole room is alive, a twisted reflection of some dark and ancient force. Return what? I whisper to myself, though I already know the answer. The book. It wants me to return the book. But to where? To whom? I glance at the door, but it's still locked, the exit just as unreachable as before. The walls feel tighter now, the space closing in on me, suffocating me with every breath. The book is the only thing that matters now. It's the only thing that's real. I look down at the pages again, the words now blurring together, as if they're written by an invisible hand that knows more than I do. And then I see it. The final passage. The keeper will return what was lost. But once it is returned, the story will begin anew. The words are clear now. They're not just a warning, they're a prophecy. A truth I can't deny. The figure behind me is waiting, its presence a looming shadow over everything I thought I knew. The bookstore is no longer just a place, it's the center of something much darker, something far more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. I reach for the book, trembling as my fingers brush against the pages. The sensation is overwhelming, like the book is pulling me into its world. I can feel it. It's calling to me, whispering in a language that my mind can barely comprehend. The figure moves closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It's standing just behind me now, its cold breath brushing against the back of my neck. I can feel its presence, like an unseen hand pressing down on me. Return it, the figure whispers. I close my eyes, bracing myself. With one final, trembling motion, I turn the page. And then everything goes dark. I don't know how much time passes, but when I open my eyes again, the bookstore is completely still. The shelves are untouched, the air thick with silence. The clock on the wall ticks softly, its hands moving again, though I'm not sure what time it is anymore. I stand there, the book still clutched in my hands. The figure is gone, but its presence lingers, a shadow in the back of my mind. And then, as if from nowhere, a single word echoes through the room. You've returned. I don't understand. But I know one thing for sure, the story isn't over. It never will be. I stand in the dead silence of the bookstore, the sound of my breath too loud against the stillness. The word, you've returned, lingers in the air, sharp and echoing. It's as if the room itself is breathing, exhaling this phrase as a reminder that whatever happens here is no longer under my control. I don't know how much time has passed. The clock on the wall ticks steadily, its hands moving in real time, but I can't shake the feeling that something is off. The air is still thick, heavy with the remnants of the unease that has soaked into the walls, the shelves, the very fabric of this place. I can't tell whether I've just woken from a nightmare or if it's only just begun. I glance down at the book in my hands. It feels different now, somehow. The weight of it is more pronounced, its pages thicker, as though it's grown with the passing moments. The words on the pages are still there, but they've shifted. They're no longer just phrases, they are sentences. Sentences that seem to speak directly to me, each one more chilling than the last. The story never ends. I shudder. The sentence is written in bold, dark ink, as though it was made to stand out. My heart pounds in my chest as I realize what that means. It's not just the book. It's me. I am part of it now. The figure. The whispering. the words. Everything in this book story is tied together by something beyond my understanding. I want to scream, to throw the book aside and run for the door. But I know it's no use. The door won't open. The bookstore won't let me leave. I force myself to look at the next page. And there it is, another sentence, this time in a different handwriting. It's a strange script, almost too elegant to be real, as though it was written by a hand not of this world. You have become the keeper now. I freeze. The words hit me like a physical blow. The keeper. The figure. The book. It all starts to make sense, but I don't want it to. I can't accept it. I want to rip the pages out, to destroy the book, to do anything to undo what's been done. But deep down, I know it's impossible. The book has chosen me, just as it chose the others before me. The footsteps. The whispers. They were never meant for anyone else. They were meant for me. The air feels colder now, the temperature dropping rapidly, as though the very essence of this place is turning against me. The shadows deepen, stretching long and unnatural across the room. I turn, half expecting to see the figure again, but the shelves are empty. The aisles are quiet. The door is still locked. I try to take a step forward, but my legs are frozen, as though they're rooted to the ground. The book is still in my hands, the words on the pages still shifting and changing, like they have a life of their own. I want to rip them out. I want to scream, to fight, to do anything to break free. But the book holds me captive. And then, in the back of my mind, I hear it, the whisper. It's soft at first, barely a breath. You belong to the story now. It's not just a whisper. It's a command. A promise. The story has a grip on me, and there's no escaping it. It owns me. It will always own me. I try to pull away, to stop reading, but my eyes refuse to leave the page. My hands tremble as I turn to the next one. The story begins again. The words burn into my mind, and with that, I understand. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. The bookstore, the figure, the book, they are all part of a cycle that can never be broken. Once you've entered, there's no leaving. And as the words settle in, I feel it, the presence, the weight of it, like 1,000 eyes watching, waiting for me to do what comes next. The keeper of the bookstore. The one who is always there, always watching, always waiting for the next story to begin. I close the book, but the pages keep turning. It doesn't matter that I've stopped reading. The story doesn't need me to read it. The story lives in me now. And as the light begins to fade, I hear the footsteps once again, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. But this time, I don't run. I don't try to hide. I just wait, knowing that the story has already begun again. And I am the keeper now. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.